Do you want to know if the Game Awards got it right? Well, you've come to the right place. Hey, it's Game Rant, and this week on Gamers Said, we asked, were the right games nominated for Game of the Year? And up first is Nick, who says, quote, where is Sonic X Shadow Generations? And Paper Mario Thousand Year Door, end quote. And Nick, these certainly weren't on my mind despite really enjoying the Thousand Year Door remaster. Nintendo went back and made very light changes to the overall game, mostly quality of life improvements and some very brief character moments, but overall it's very much the same game that's been available on the GameCube for the past 2 decades. And I should know, I've had my copy for about half that long, and no, it wasn't cheap. And yet, even as a fan, I couldn't see nominating this remaster. Now, if you want to say it holds up great, even against modern games, then I'll agree. But treating it as a new game? Nope, I don't think I could swing that. How about letting us know how you feel in the comments below? What does have a bit more merit is Sonic X Shadow Generations. Rather than re-releasing one of the best modern Sonic games, again, Sega did a little bit of tinkering to add good old Shadow to the mix. In fact, if you're just in it to play as Shadow, you're getting a sizable amount of new content. Now, most of that is still based on previously released stages that were in the 2011 original, and those are of course 2D and 3D interpretations of older Sonic games. But you know what? That mix and match is sort of the whole gimmick of the game. Still not sure that argument would get a Game of the Year nomination. However, I am surprised to see neither game get a nomination for anything at all. Not for music, not even Family Game. Wow, tough crowd this year. Up next is Mel44, who says, quote, I would love to have seen Dragon's Dogma 2. Such a great game for me, it would be up there for Game of the Year, end quote. And now here's a proper 2024 release, and a long one coming for fans of the cult classic Dragon's Dogma. Was it worth the wait? Well, it really depends on who you ask. It did manage to nab a Best RPG nomination after all, but somewhere in the conversation, expectations clearly got confused, as some players were utterly perplexed at this esoteric game design. What sort of open-world RPG doesn't have fast travel these days? Dragon's Dogma, that's who. And really the unusual, often antagonistic design of the game isn't some sort of accommodation. It's a conversation between the audience and the dungeon masters. In this case, those quirky developers at Capcom. Give it a few years and Dragon's Dogma 2 will probably slow burn into pulp culture acceptance, just like the first one did. I guess they really nailed the assignment. Up next is Chad, who gives us a general review of 2024. Quote, there were a lot of great games this year that I am sad didn't get a chance to go up against the big boys. While none of them have a chance against the likes of Astrobot, Black Myth, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I would like to say that Hades 2 and Palworld deserve to at least stand among them. Space Marine 2 and Dragon's Dogma 2 were amazing, but maybe not enough to put them in the golden circle, end quote. Some really interesting references here. Palworld has a total of 0 nominations, and some will say that game simply isn't worth discussing, but if that were true, why do people still continue to play and enjoy Palworld? Others will say it's just a derivative of Pokemon, but anyone who's seen the extended gameplay loop of Palworld knows that simply isn't true. Although it is undeniable there are similarities when it comes to some of the creature design. But again, anyone with enough knowledge of character design will recognize the similarities in Pokemon with other pulp culture they're borrowing from. Heck, Nintendo has faced some rather serious litigation over it, and now in turn, Palworld is under legal jeopardy at the moment. Nintendo has challenged Pocket Pair over patent infringements in an effort to end sales of Palworld altogether. So why didn't it get a nomination? Probably because we're all too busy glued to our phones reading about the lawsuit to actually play the game. Just kidding, Chad. It's because it's in early access. Now, Hades 2 seems like the sort of game that would easily secure a nomination, yet it didn't. So what happened? Well, just like Palworld, it's not out yet. Yes, Hades 2 and its single player aren't always associated with early access, but as Game of the Year 2023 winner Baldur's Gate 3 has proven, it won't prohibit a game from receiving a nomination after it sees a full release. But here's some good news for Chad. Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2 did receive 2 nominations in the action and multiplayer category. It may not have the grand vision of many other larger games, but Space Marine 2 has been well received by fans new and old. Instead of fleshing out a whole world and padding out the runtime, Space Marine 2 pushes you right into the meat grinder with reckless abandon. Ultimately, this gives the game design greater control over the player. But as anyone who's played Space Marine 2 will tell you, it sets up many of its rules only to break them later on. Now, if games were rated purely on their grimdark appeal, I'd wager Space Marine 2 would walk away with all the trophies. But sadly, more qualities must be taken into account. Up next is Mr8 The Hexblade Warlock, who touches on a major issue we'll address in a bit. Quote, I can't believe Stalker 2 won't be nominated. It feels cheap after all the hard work and hype going into that game. Heck, Phil Spencer 2 praised its potential. Aside from the Elden Ring DLC, I can understand the nominees. May the best game win. win, end quote. Now, personally speaking, Mr8 The Hexblade Warlock, I would put Stalker 2 on my list, but I can completely accept that the vast majority of people will need a lot more time warming up to the Eurojank mechanics. And that's not a derivative. Eurojank expects the player to roleplay to a ridiculous degree. Heck, it wasn't so long ago that The Witcher and its numerous swords and silver blades were considered convoluted Eurojank. But with enough time, us Westerners have learned to enjoy the thematic complexities of some of these mechanics. And Stalker 2 continues that tradition with extremely unforgiving difficulty. Every corner could wipe you out. Every small fall could be your demise. It puts you in a state of tension that is naturally at odds with what the player expects or wants. Suddenly the player isn't sure what's going to come next, creating a suspension of disbelief, and that increases engagement, and sometimes frustration. But give it a few years, and I think people will learn to love Stalker 2. Up next is, well, a lot of people, all talking about the same thing. So much so, it was just easier to split the video in half and address the controversy now. One of the Game of the Year nominees is none other than Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. Now that name may ring a bell, and no, we're not talking Dark Souls, because of course Elden Ring has not only been nominated for Game of the Year previously, it won. And then that one kid got up on stage and said some weird things. Remember that? Anyway, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree is not a new game, but it is new DLC, and that's got our comments section adamantly disagreeing with the decision. Let's start off with Dominic, who says, quote, TGA needs a DLC category. It was silly when Blood and Wine was nominated for Game of the Year in 2015, and it's still silly to see Shadow of the Erdtree nominated this year. A DLC is not a game, no matter how great it is. The remaining nominees make sense to me. End quote. Vlad gets right to the point, quote, no DLCs for Game of the Year, please, end quote. No, this is Patrick, hey, I get that reference by the way, agrees. Quote, the nominees are good, except the DLC, which is a DLC from a game that already won Game of the Year. I don't know if it's a marketing thing, but it's illogical to push a DLC into the Game of the Year category, end quote. Mike gives us his 2 cents while also commenting on the controversy. Quote, Black Myth Wukong should most definitely win Game of the Year, but if Final Fantasy VII Rebirth wins, I would understand. It was very well made. Elden Ring should not be nominated for Game of the Year. DLC of the Year is a category it should be under. End quote. Brian agrees. Quote, outside of Elden Ring, I think the nominees are pretty fair. It's just odd we're having a DLC considered for Game of the Year in 2024 when we've had many amazing DLCs released beforehand and not given the same consideration. End quote. Oliver chimes in with a snarky reply. Quote, I think Spider-Man 2 DLC should be nominated instead of Shadow of the Erdtree. Oh wait. End quote. Very funny. And Levi 2 disagrees with the Game Awards. Quote, DLC shouldn't be in the Game of the Year category. They need to make a DLC of the Year category. End quote. Reply after reply after reply. Without a doubt, the main issue of this week's conversation has been the nomination of Shadow of the Erdtree. Even if the comment didn't have a suggestion for another game, the mere addition of Erdtree simply does not sit right with a lot of gamers. But speaking personally as someone who hasn't played the DLC, I don't mind it being on the list. Mostly because DLC has sporadically appeared in the Game Awards for years, just like Dominic said with The Witcher 3. For instance, last year's Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty was nominated for Best Narrative, Best Performance, and Player's Choice. So clearly there's an audience pushing for it. But it brings up an interesting question. Where can we draw the line for DLC? All that dialogue and storytelling was of a higher caliber than most games. And you don't have to take my word for it. Idris Elba is literally your point man in the story. It's a tremendous campaign that is absolutely predicated on your experience in the prior game. But if I'm understanding this correctly, even if it was the best experience of the year, it shouldn't be nominated for Game of the Year? I'm not so sure I agree. If somehow the Marvel Cinematic Universe makes the best movie of the year, would we have to discount it because ultimately it's a work connected to several dozen other films? I don't think so. Yes, we're talking about passive versus active forms of entertainment, but one of the reasons this came to mind was because of this anonymous comment. Quote, everyone complaining about a DLC with 30 to 50 hours of content being on the list, but a remake of a game that is the same amount of playtime, 20 years old, and broken into 3 separate full-price games is fine. Nothing to see here, right? End quote. And again, personally speaking, I have no issue with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth being nominated or split up into different games. But if you ask me to spot the difference between this and Shadow of the Erdtree, in the long run, there's really not that much. Although I really like Final Fantasy VII being split up. That game was an insane patchwork of early 3D design, and attempting to turn it into a cohesive world with a consistent modern art style was always going to be more time-consuming and expensive. If they're gonna do it, I'd rather they do it right. And so far they are. Ultimately, the merit of a video game is how it makes you feel. Yeah, it's really that subjective. And awards are quite literally popularity contests. If so many critics and industry industry people found Shadow of the Erdtree to be worthy of a nomination? Well, you don't have to agree with the quality of the game, but it does speak to the quality of their experience. Which is why we want to hear from you. How do you feel about this year's Game Award nominations? Still feel like something's missing? How do you feel about the DLC controversy? Let's chat back in the comments. Keep clicking right here on Game Rant, and we'll see you next time.